So what I decided to do was sell the Tesla, and with the equity from that car, get a Nissan Leaf, 3 years old, second-hand Nissan Leaf, with 30,000 miles on the clock for £11,500. Now obviously the Nissan Leaf's range is nothing like the Tesla, so we needed some solution for our long trips and camping trips. But of course those are kind of infrequent, they're not the daily driver sort of trips. So I picked up this Land Rover for £3,500, which has got 7 seats, and that's the interesting thing. So one of the other reasons I was kind of keen to sell the Tesla sooner rather than later, when I saw the depreciation kind of kicking in the way it was doing. We quite often find ourselves wanting to go to the beach with my parents, my kids' grandparents, and we thought to take them with us would be really brilliant. Save 2 cars, and they don't really like the drive anymore, it's quite a way for them to go. So we were kind of thinking it would be nice to have a 7-seat car. So we've kind of got the best tools for the job now with these 2 cars. No monthly repayments, no huge upfront cash flow situation. So I did a video on my main channel looking at the economics of the Tesla and how it, if you keep it long enough, over 10 years, it will kind of pan out. The fuel savings will offset the depreciation and at least kind of get it in line with depreciation that you'd expect on a normal kind of car. It offsets that premium price tag over its lifespan. And I made the point in that video that there is this cash flow caveat. You have to obviously find all that money kind of essentially up front. Even if you're using finance, you're still going to be paying all of that money off way before the end of the life of the car. So we had a loft conversion earlier in the year, and we had to borrow a lot more money than we thought we were going to. So I thought it actually made sense to get rid of the Tesla at this point, because there's just too much money tied up in it, and there's too much going out in repayments on it as well. Luckily, I just about managed to sell it before I took too much of a hit on that depreciation. It was almost at the point where it was suddenly starting to depreciate so quickly that I was kind of nearly locked into doing the 10-year plan whether I wanted to or not. So it's interesting that that cash flow caveat is now actually affecting me. And you know, in the back of my mind, I kind of thought there might be something that would come up in our lives where that did happen. So it's kind of actually a risky decision to try and commit to doing this over the 10-year lifespan. You know, you are kind of potentially locking yourself in. Obviously, as long as the cars are not depreciating quickly, you can sell at any point and get away. But of course, the reality is that cars do depreciate, and we're seeing that now more than ever with EVs. In fact, it looks like they're depreciating basically faster now than combustion engine counterparts. We're still getting the fuel savings of an electric car for the bulk of our day-to-day driving, and we've got the luxury of this amazing 4-wheel drive 7-seat long-distance cruiser, which is a really incredible machine, and we're going to look at that more in this channel later as well. So the really interesting thing is actually how the Nissan is at the point now where the fuel savings from it being an EV pay for its own depreciation more or less in real time. There's no front loading, there's no upfront investment and waiting 10 years for it to all work out. You buy this for £11,000, you keep it for 3 or 4 years, you sell it for 5 or 6 grand. That depreciation is offset completely by the fuel savings of it being an EV, if you can charge at home. Of course, that's the old caveat with EVs, and of course we can charge at home, so it does work for us. We're probably anticipating driving around 8,000 miles a year in the Nissan, and the rest will be in the Land Rover. So with that 8,000 miles a year, we're saving about £130 a month in fuel. And I reckon the depreciation is probably, after 3 or 4 years, going to look like about £100 a month. That leaves a little bit left over for the electric bill, of course. So when you look at it like that, it's really interesting because it's actually a free car. So obviously we're paying normal money for the Land Rover and the diesel and the repairs on that, but I'm doing that myself, so that works out quite interestingly from an economics perspective as well. The amount of money you save once you kind of get involved with DIY work on your car, very interesting. It's actually all working out really well because 2 cars is obviously more useful than 1 car. Now this is what's really interesting. The reason this works is because the Nissan is only a 40 kilowatt battery. It's got about 130, 150 mile range. That means it's obviously depreciating like a stone because most people think they want a car with longer range. But unless you're actually doing that range every day, you don't really need to think like that. You can just have another petrol car. So you kind of ask yourself, why are you spending 50 grand on an EV that can do 300 miles of range if you're not doing that all the time? Even if it's only at the weekends that you need that kind of range, it still makes sense to pick up an old 40 kilowatt EV like this Nissan and keep your petrol car for the long trips. The only obviously downside of having 2 cars is the insurance. But insurance on a Tesla is going to be easily double that of a 3-year-old Leaf, so I'm not too concerned by that either. And of course, it's still only a 3-year-old car. It's got Apple CarPlay, really good safety, and all this, you know, fancy, very comfortable, very nice car actually. So it's absolutely fantastic to think that this is kind of the equivalent to a free car. Of course, I miss the really amazing technology of the Tesla, but the reality is this setup is actually much more functional for us, having the two cars, and one of them being a really nice long-distance 7-seat cruiser, and the other being a brilliant small town car. In some ways, we've got the setup now that's better than the Tesla. There's no compromises. The small car is a better small car than the Tesla, and the big car is a better big car than the Tesla was as well. Of course, in real terms, had we kept the Tesla for the 10 years, maybe it probably would have ended up costing about the same as what I'm doing now. But of course, we would have had to have lived with all our capital tied up in the car up front, and not having access to it like we have with this setup, with much lower upfront investment. So I think it's actually super interesting thinking about the economics this way. I think a lot of people in their mind, they think they need a car with certain range. They're going to get an electric car when it has 300 plus miles of range. But actually the EVs like the Nissan here with 40 kilowatts are so cheap, it doesn't actually matter. You can sort of ask yourself, you can get a nice diesel car for £3,000 or £4,000 for the long trips, and you can get an old EV, and you haven't had to spend £50,000 on a car with 300 miles of range. So the difference between a 150 mile range car and a 300 mile range car is about sort of £30,000–40,000. The Nissan was 10,000, the Tesla's 50,000. So you're spending a lot just for the ability to do those long trips, when an old cheap petrol car can do that just fine. When you do all the maths here, it's actually really fascinating. Of course, there's the whole political agenda of getting everyone in EVs as soon as possible, and there's the EV evangelists that, as soon as they switch to an EV, they can't stand the idea of having a combustion car. I think obviously the reality is most people are not thinking like that. They're driven much more by their financial situation, and I think the setup that we've got here works particularly well because a lot of people have got an older combustion car that works perfectly well for them, and they're still running around in that. But actually, if they took the sort of all of the local journeys, we'd probably find that add up to a big bulk of that. In our case, it works out about 8,000 miles a year. That can be done by an EV like a Nissan Leaf, which can be bought for much less than a combustion car of the same kind of age and spec. And that's what's super interesting, because you can switch to this, and of course then the reality is we're getting all these fumes out of the towns, and it's working pretty well. I think this is a really interesting way of looking at this whole EV debate that we're going through at the moment. We've got a lot of people who are kind of really anti-EV, and they think the whole thing's a disaster, and they keep trying to claim that they catch fire and all of this stuff. And then on the other side, we've got all these EV evangelists who think, obviously they're the answer to everyone's problems, but I think the reality is actually quite different. And this middle ground in the debate, I think, is quite nicely occupied by this combination of cars that we've got here at the moment. And the economics of it all kind of stack up in a very interesting way. You kind of get the benefits of the EV for a lot of your driving without that initial cash flow problem up front. Of course, the Tesla is still an amazing piece of engineering, and I think if you are in the market for something at that price point, there is no competition, and you should watch this video next where I explain the reasons why that's the case.